Bruce was waking up from anesthesia and coming to his senses. At first, the man saw the whole world as a set of blurry images and outlines, which were mostly white. And only when Bruce finally managed to completely open his eyes did he realize that he was in a hospital room. Before the man had time to get to his bearings, a doctor wearing hospital scrubs and a white coat approached him. "Congratulations, young man. Your transplant surgery was successful, and your life is no longer in danger." Just as we expected, the donor's heart was a perfect match for you, the cardiac surgeon announced in a soft voice. Bruce carefully lifted his head and looked at the left side of his chest, which was hidden behind a thick layer of gauze and bandages. Finally plucking up his courage, the man cautiously asked, "Dr. Matthews, sir, can I ask who my donor was?" The doctor looked reproachfully at the patient, and his face immediately became serious. "Well, this is confidential information, of course. Although, if you really want to know, I can give you the donor's name, but only if you promise that it will stay between us," Rupert Matthews said with an emphasis on the last word. Of course, you have my word," Bruce hastened to assure the doctor. The cardiac surgeon chuckled in response and promised the patient to give him information about his donor before he got discharged from the hospital. "In the meantime, you need to rest, young man. Sleep, read some books, and get used to your new heart. Now you got one that works perfectly." The doctor said goodbye and left the room. Seeing the heart surgeon off with his eyes, Bruce sighed sadly and thought about his past. Bruce Fletcher had recently turned 25, and most of his life he spent teetering on the brink of life and death. Congenital heart disease was discovered too late. The first signs of the deadly condition only appeared when he was in elementary school. Ever since then, Bruce often got excruciating spasms in his chest, which eventually turned his life into a living hell. His parents, Pamela and Robert Fletcher, did everything they could to save their son. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts, it only became possible a month ago. All this time, the family lived in fear. Every day that Bruce didn't die was considered a real victory for the Fletchers. And now, lying in a hospital bed and listening to the donor's heartbeat in his chest, Bruce thanked the Lord for saving him. I wonder who that person was. What did he do? Did he have a family? Did he like to watch baseball games? The man thought, wrinkling his forehead. But the more questions Bruce asked himself, the better he understood that the answers could only be found outside the hospital. The rehabilitation period dragged on very slowly, and by the time he was discharged, the man was already willing to escape the hospital, even through the window. To Bruce's delight, Rupert Matthews kept his promise and gave him information about his donor. Clutching the piece of paper with information about the man whose heart saved his life, Bruce quickly read what he longed to know for so long. Howard Brooks, philosophy professor at the university. He died in a car accident and decided to become a donor shortly before his death. Bruce read, moving his lips. Upon learning the name of his savior, the man felt very uncomfortable. A professor at the university. That's something I'd expect the least of all. I thought my donor would either be a biker or some homeless person, Bruce thought, putting the piece of paper in his bag. The excited voices of his parents distracted the man from his painful thoughts. They drove up to the hospital to pick him up. "Well, son, I'm so glad it's finally over," said Robert Fletcher happily. "But that doesn't mean that your treatment is over. You still have to take your meds and come in for regular checkups for the next 6 months," Bruce's mother hastened to remind her son. Bruce smiled knowingly and winked at his father. Then, the three of them walked out of the hospital together and headed for their Chevrolet that was parked in the hospital parking lot. On their way home, Bruce told his parents that he had learned about his donor. But when Pamela Fletcher heard the name of her son's savior, she felt clearly uneasy. "Mom, what's wrong?" "You sick?" Bruce asked anxiously. But the woman had already pulled herself together and hastened to switch the conversation to a different topic. But this episode stuck to Bruce's head and haunted him for several days to come. The man worried about it for about 2 weeks. Having finally plucked up his courage, Bruce decided to ask his mother about Howard Brooks. Mrs. Fletcher looked surprised at first and tried to avoid answering the question. But then, seeing how determined her son was, she realized that ignoring the question was no longer an option. "I didn't want to tell you, Bruce, but please try and understand me. The truth is that I had a relationship with Howard Brooks back when I was at college. But then we had a fight over something unimportant and broke up. I think it was partly because of his mother. The woman never really liked me," Pamela Fletcher whispered, stammering at every word. Having heard his mother out, Bruce got dizzy and his heart started racing. He didn't know how to act in such a situation, so he simply went to his room to lay down. "So that's what happened. I got my new heart from my mother's ex-boyfriend?" Bruce thought, surprised at his own discovery. After this memorable conversation with her son, Pamela Fletcher chose not to return to it again and continued to act like nothing had happened. But Bruce wasn't about to give up so easily. He decided to find the relatives of Howard Brooks by all means possible. After all, it was his tragic death that gave him a chance at a normal life. Turning to the help desk, the young man quickly found out the address where Mr. Brooks used to live. Meanwhile, Bruce felt some kind of elation all the time. It seemed to the young man that his donor's heart was like a compass, guiding him where he needed to go. Bruce quickly found the house he needed on Park Street. Mustering up his courage, the young man carefully pressed doorbell. Nothing happened at first, but a couple of minutes later, he could hear someone's quiet steps coming from the depths of the house. Bruce was very surprised to see a young woman of about 25 open the door for him. She had beautiful blue eyes and blonde curly hair. "Can I help you?" the woman asked quietly. "I hope so. The fact is that the heart of the former owner of this house is beating in my chest. You see, before his death, Howard Brooks decided to become an organ donor. And so, doctors ran the tests and it was a match for me. So I got the transplant surgery," Bruce blurted out in one breath. After the young man's confession, the woman teared up instantly. "Well, please come inside. I'm Lois. I'm Howard Brooks' daughter," the woman added with a sob. At this point, Bruce regretted his idea for the first time. But it was too late to retreat, so he accepted Lois's invitation. Soon, the young people were already sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea and eating some pastry. To Bruce's surprise, Lois Brooks turned out to be a very interesting woman who decided to follow in her father's footsteps and become a philosophy professor. The woman knew countless parables and funny stories that quickly lightened the mood in the house. At some point, Bruce even caught himself thinking that he was enjoying her company very much. As it turned out, Lois's mother died of cancer 7 years ago, and she lost her father through the fault of a drunk driver who drove into the oncoming lane. Since then, the woman lived alone and devoted all of her free time to studying. Without even realizing it, Bruce and Lois talked for about 2 hours and started feeling a strong sympathy for each other. Finally, when it came time for Bruce to leave, Lois invited him to come back again tomorrow to take a walk in the park and feed the ducks at the pond. "Of course. Thanks for the invite. I'll be there," Bruce promised and walked out the door. Meanwhile, the man was in for a rather unpleasant conversation back at home. As it turned out, alarmed by her son's long absence, Pamela Fletcher got the entire neighborhood worried, trying to locate him. It was only when the woman saw Bruce safe and sound that she finally calmed down. Of course, she couldn't have known that her son was visiting her ex-boyfriend's daughter just some half an hour ago. The next day, Bruce went to meet Lois at the park as promised. Laughing happily, the young people bought a number of buns from a food stand and fed them to the ducks. People passing them couldn't help but smile at the sight of Bruce trying to feed all the ducks at once, throwing a cascade of bread pellets and crumbs into the lake. This meeting went much better than the previous one and laid a solid foundation for the strong relationship between Bruce and Lois. Since then, the young people started seeing each other almost every day, spending all of their free time together. However, despite his obvious feelings for Lois, Bruce was still afraid to tell her that his mother had once dated her late father. The man was afraid to admit that with the help of the donor's heart, he unwittingly became part of the Brooks family. However, as we all know, nothing stays secret forever, and Bruce's secret was no exception. One day, he did tell Lois about his mother, but the woman's response made Bruce instantly break into a sweat. "Are you sure that my dad had nothing to do with your birth? What if he was your biological father too?" Lois exclaimed. The woman's suggestion shocked Bruce so much that he was ready to sink into the ground. Could my mother have really gotten pregnant by another man? Had she been deceiving my father for so many years? Bruce whispered, terrified at the thought. Lois only spread her hands and shook her head sadly in response. Unfortunately, Bruce knew very well that his mother would be very reluctant to reveal the secret of his past. On the other hand, the man didn't actually want to destroy his world as he knew it, nor did he want to believe that Lois could be his half-sister. Having a hard time digesting this information, Bruce felt desperately lost and fell into a depression. The fact was that the man was already seriously thinking about marrying Lois. But how could he marry a woman who could be his half-sister? This thought was simply killing Bruce. It haunted him for several days. And when it seemed that there was no way out of the unfortunate situation, something happened that drastically changed everything. It all started with the fact that on their next date, Lois handed Bruce a folder with some documents. "What is it?" the young man asked in surprise. "Open it and take a look. You'll understand everything right away," Lois answered with a mysterious smile. Bruce opened the folder cautiously and skimmed through its contents. There was one phrase that stood out against all the rest of the text. It read, "To give custody over the 3-year-old orphan, Lois Hill." What does it all mean? Bruce exclaimed louder than he should have. "It means that I'm not Howard Brooks' biological daughter. They adopted me 22 years ago. I'm actually an orphan. I was cleaning my father's room today and accidentally discovered these documents," Lois replied, moving her bangs off of her eyes. And then it hit Bruce what it actually meant. The young man was so happy and so relieved that he picked Lois up and whirled her around the yard. Laughing merrily, the young people were incredibly relieved that there was no way that they could be blood relatives. And that meant only one thing for Lois and Bruce. They could now safely announce their engagement and get married and start their own family.